I realized I wasn't alone, because the silence stopped. It wasn't a sudden noise that alerted me. It wasn't a snap of a twig or the cry of a bird. It was the opposite. The forest, which had been humming with the low static buzz of crickets and wind, simply cut out. Like a television being unplugged, one moment there was sound and the next there was nothing. And in that nothing I heard a second step. I have been walking for a long time. I don't remember how long. Time is difficult to measure when there is no light and no reference point. I am on a narrow trail. It is not a hiking trail with markers or clear gravel. It is just a strip of dirt, barely wide enough for my shoulders, cutting through a dense wall of trees. The trees are tall, old pines, packed so tightly together that their trunks form a solid wooden corridor on either side of me. There is no undergrowth, no bushes, just the vertical bars of the trunks and the dark canopy above that blocks out the moon and stars. It is a tunnel made of wood and shadows. I don't know why I am here. I know I should know. I know that if I thought about it hard enough, I could probably remember a car or a house or a reason to step outside. But right now, the memory feels slippery, like water running through my fingers. The only thing that feels real is the act of walking, left foot, right foot. The crunch of dry pine needles under my boots. That sound is my anchor. It tells me I am moving forward. But a minute ago, the rhythm broke. I stopped walking. The sound of my boots stopped instantly. But there was a pause, a delay of maybe half a second, and then there was another crunch. It came from behind me. It sounded like my boot hitting the dirt, but it was softer, muffled. I stood perfectly still. I held my breath. I listened. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. It pressed against my ears. I told myself it was an echo. Acoustics are strange in dense forests. Sound bounces. I told myself it was a branch falling from a tree, settling onto the forest floor. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, a deer. Animals make noise. The forest is full of them. But the silence that followed that second step was absolute. The crickets did not start up again. The wind did not rustle the needles. The forest was holding its breath. I waited for a full minute. My heart beat hard against my ribs, a fast thumping that seemed too loud in the quiet. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to look down the dark corridor I had just walked through. But I couldn't. My neck felt stiff. The thought of seeing what was behind me was more terrifying than the thought of not knowing. So I started walking again. I walked faster. I didn't run. Running in the dark on a narrow trail is dangerous. Roots could trip me. I could twist an ankle. But I lengthened my stride. I wanted to put distance between me and that sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The rhythm was steady. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And then I heard it again. It was faint, but it was there. It was matching my pace. I took 3 steps. 1, 2, 3. From behind, a split second later. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't an echo. An echo repeats the sound immediately. This had a gap. It was the gap it takes for a person to lift their foot and place it down. It was the sound of someone walking, someone who was copying me. I stopped again. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps behind me stopped too. I didn't wait this time. I didn't freeze for a minute. I spun around instantly, shining the beam of my flashlight down the trail. The light cut through the darkness. It revealed a straight line of dirt, surrounded by the tightly packed trees. It went back for maybe 50 yards before it curved slightly to the left. There was no one there. The trail was empty. I swept the light back and forth. I checked the spaces between the trees. The trunks were black, the bark rough and furrowed. There were deep shadows between them, pockets of darkness that the light couldn't penetrate, but nothing moved. I stood there for a long time. I shone the light on the ground. There were my footprints, deep, distinct impressions in the needles, and next to them, nothing, no other prints, just the untouched dirt. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was being paranoid. I was tired. The darkness plays tricks on the mind. It turns shadows into shapes and silence into voices. I turned back around to face the direction I was going. I took a deep breath and exhaled. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight, a small white cloud that vanished quickly. I started walking again. I walked for another 10 minutes. I tried to keep my pace slow and deliberate. I tried to focus on the feeling of movement, on the physical sensation of my legs working. I needed to ground myself in the reality of my body. The trail remained the same, straight, narrow, lined with trees. It felt like I was walking through a painting that was being painted as I moved. The view ahead was always the same. Dark trees, darker sky, the path disappearing into the gloom. I began to notice the trees. They were all the same species, of course, pines. But they were also the same size, the same thickness. The distance between them was identical. It felt artificial. Not like a forest that grew over centuries, but like a corridor that was built. I stopped to look at the trunk on my left. I reached out and touched the bark. It was cold, dry, rough. I looked at the trunk on my right. It was exactly the same distance away. I looked ahead. The spacing was the same. It felt like a hallway in a very old, very large building where the walls are made of wood instead of plaster. I pushed the thought away. Forests grow in patterns. Nature seeks order in chaos. This was normal. I just needed to keep walking. If I kept walking, I would eventually reach a road, or a clearing, or a house. I took a step, and then I noticed the light. My flashlight was dimming. I had put fresh batteries in before I left. I was sure of that. But the beam was getting weaker. The circle of light on the ground was shrinking. The edges were turning from white to yellow to a dull orange. I tapped the flashlight against my palm. It flickered, then stabilized. I checked my watch. I couldn't see the face in the dark, so I held the light up to my wrist. The hands weren't moving. I shook my wrist. I tapped the glass of the watch. The second hand was frozen at the 12. I stopped. I stood very still. I listened. The forest was silent again. That heavy, intentional silence. The kind of silence that feels like it is watching you. I realized that I hadn't heard a single animal since I started walking. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, not even a mosquito buzzing in my ear. The only sound was me. My footsteps, my breathing, my heart. It was as if the forest was empty of everything except me and the thing behind me. I hadn't heard it for a while. The footsteps. But suddenly, the urge to look was overwhelming. I felt it between my shoulder blades, a prickle of heat, a physical certainty that if I turned around, the tunnel would not be empty this time. I didn't want to look. I wanted to keep walking forward. Forward was progress. Forward was a way. But I had to know. I turned around slowly. I kept the flashlight pointed down at the ground. I was afraid to shine it into the darkness, afraid of what the light would reveal. I looked at the trail behind me. It was empty, but the trail was different. I stared at the dirt. I looked at the footprints, my footprints, leading back into the darkness. They were fading, not like footprints fade over time, as the wind blows dust over them. They were fading as I looked at them, The edges of the impressions were blurring, smoothing out. The dirt was erasing itself. I looked at the trees. The trunks seemed closer together than they were a minute ago. Or maybe the trail was narrower. It was hard to tell. I looked up. The canopy above was a solid mass of black. There was no break, no sky, just the overlapping branches, weaving together like a thatched roof. I felt a wave of nausea. I turned back around. I needed to get out. I needed to move faster. I started to walk. Then I jogged. The beam of my flashlight bobbed wildly, casting jumping shadows that danced around me. Crunch, crunch, crunch. My breath was coming in short gasps. And then, from behind me, the sound returned. It was louder this time. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It wasn't just matching my pace anymore. It was keeping up. I ran. I didn't care about roots or twisting ankles. I ran. I pumped my arms, staring straight ahead, watching the light beam cut a path through the gloom. The footsteps behind me broke into a run, too. I could hear the heavy thud of boots on the dirt, the slap of a foot against the hard-packed earth. It was rhythmic. It was relentless. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran for what felt like an hour. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead. The air was cold, biting at my throat. But the trail didn't change. It didn't end. It didn't curve. It just went on, straight, narrow, endless. The trees were blurring past me. I realized something. The trees were moving, not swaying in the wind. They were moving closer. The corridor was narrowing. The space between the trees on either side was shrinking. The trail was getting tighter. I had to run with my arms pulled in against my chest to avoid brushing against the bark. The footsteps behind me were getting louder. I could hear a sound now, mixed with the footsteps. A sound of breathing, a wet, rasping inhalation. It was right behind me. I screamed. I screamed into the darkness, a primal sound of fear and frustration. I stopped running. I couldn't run anymore. My body was exhausted. I spun around, shining the dying flashlight directly behind me. The beam was weak now, a dull orange cone of light that barely reached 10 feet. I expected to see a face, a person, a monster, but the trail was empty. The breathing sound stopped. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, panting, sweat running down my back. "Who is there?" I yelled. My voice sounded flat, dead. It didn't echo. It was swallowed by the trees immediately. There was no answer. I turned back around. I took a step forward and hit a wall. I stumbled back, confused. I shone the light forward. The trail was gone. The trees had closed. The wall of pines was solid. The trunks were packed so tightly together that there was no gap, no dirt, no path, just wood. I spun around again. I checked behind me. The path was still there, stretching back into the darkness. I turned to the front again. I walked up to the trees. I put my hands on the rough bark. I pushed. They didn't move. They felt like iron bars. They felt endless. I couldn't go forward. I looked at the watch on my wrist. The second hand was still frozen. I looked at the flashlight. The beam flickered and died. I was in total darkness. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't see the trees, but I could feel them. The darkness wasn't empty. It had a texture. It felt like the air was thick with dust or smoke. It coated my tongue. It felt dry. I stood still. I waited for my eyes to adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. This was a darkness that swallowed light. I realized I was trapped in a box, a wooden box, miles long, with no way out and no way forward. And then I heard the sound again. The footsteps. They weren't behind me this time. They were in front of me. On the other side of the wall of trees. Crunch, crunch, I could hear the dry needles breaking. I could hear the heavy tread. It was walking parallel to me. Crunch, crunch. Then I heard it to my left, deep in the forest, beyond the wall of trunks. Crunch, crunch, and to my right, crunch, crunch. I was surrounded. The sound wasn't coming from the trail. The trail was empty. The sound was coming from the forest itself, from the space between the trees that I couldn't reach. There were hundreds of them. I could hear a chorus of footsteps, a slow, rhythmic marching. They were all walking in the same direction. I realized then that the trail wasn't a path for me. The trail was a crack, a flaw in the structure, and the structure was repairing itself. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. It was heavier than before. It felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I reached out in the darkness. I touched the tree in front of me. Then I felt along the trunk to the next one, then the next. They were smooth. The bark was gone. They felt polished, cold. I moved my hands over the wood. It felt like a wall, a solid, seamless wall. I turned around and felt the air behind me. The trail was still there. I could feel the openness, the cold draft coming from the darkness behind me. I had two choices: stay here, frozen in the dark, pressed against the wall that had blocked my way, or go back the way I came. I took a step back, then another. I walked backward, keeping my hands out in front of me, feeling for the wall. But I didn't touch it. The path was still open. I turned around and faced the darkness of the return journey. I couldn't see anything. I had to navigate by memory and by feel. I kept one hand on the trees to my left. The bark was rough again. It felt real. I walked. I walked for a long time. I didn't know how long. Time didn't exist here. There was only the movement of my legs and the touch of the bark under my fingers. I expected to hear the footsteps following me, but there was nothing, just the silence. I kept waiting for the trees to end. I kept waiting for the curve I had seen earlier, the turn to the left, but I didn't find it. The path remained straight. I started to notice the texture of the bark under my fingers. It was repeating. I would feel a knot in the wood, a rough patch, a vertical ridge, a smooth section, and then 10 feet later, I would feel it again. The same knot, the same rough patch, the same ridge. I stopped and counted the paces between the ridges. 10 paces. I walked 10 more paces. I felt the ridge. I walked back 10 paces. I felt the ridge again. I was walking in a loop, or the forest was repeating itself. I stood in the dark. I felt a wave of hopelessness so deep, it made my knees weak. I wasn't walking through a forest. I was walking in a machine, a pattern that never ended. I sank to the ground. I sat on the dirt trail. I pulled my knees up to my chest and wrapped my arms around them. I closed my eyes. It didn't make any difference. It was just as dark with my eyes open as it was with them closed. I sat there for what felt like a lifetime. I let go of the need to move. I let go of the fear. If I was going to die here, I wanted it to be quiet. I didn't want to run anymore. As I sat there, I realized something. The silence wasn't empty. It was vibrating. I could feel it in the ground under me. A low, thrumming frequency, like the engine of a giant ship or the heartbeat of a massive animal. The forest was alive. Not alive in the way plants are alive. Alive in the way a single organism is alive. The trees were just parts of it. The darkness was just its blood. And I was the bacteria, the intruder. I sat there, and I listened to the hum. I realized that the footsteps I had heard earlier, they weren't someone chasing me. They were the sound of the forest adjusting, the sound of the walls shifting, I opened my eyes. I couldn't see, but I felt a change in the air. A light, very faint. A dim gray luminescence. It was coming from ahead of me. I stood up. I stared into the gray. It wasn't the beam of a flashlight. It wasn't the warm glow of the sun. It was the color of television static. It was a pale, sick light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As my eyes adjusted, I could see the outline of the trees. I saw that the path ahead was different. The corridor had widened. The trees were farther apart, and in the distance, maybe 50 yards ahead, there was something in the middle of the trail. It was a figure. It was standing perfectly still. I froze. I felt the terror return, sharp and cold. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall. It was thin. It looked like a shadow that had peeled itself off the wall and gained a third dimension. It didn't have a face, just a smooth blank surface where the face should be. It was wearing clothes that looked like mine, the same jacket, the same boots. It was me. I was looking at myself. I knew then that I hadn't been walking away from something. I had been walking toward it. The figure raised its hand. It pointed at me. Then it turned around. It walked away. It walked down the trail, into the deeper darkness. I wanted to call out. I wanted to scream, "Wait!" But I didn't, because I knew that if I followed it, I would never stop walking. I looked down at my feet. The ground was moving very slowly. The dirt was like a conveyor belt. The forest was moving me. I hadn't been walking at all. I had been standing still while the world moved beneath my boots. I looked back the way I came. The trail was gone. It was just a solid wall of trees. I looked forward. The figure of myself was disappearing into the gray static. I realized then that the trail wasn't a place. It was a moment. A single, stretched-out moment of fear and realization that I would live over and over again. I took a step. I didn't want to. My leg moved on its own. It was part of the mechanism now. I took another step. Crunch. I listened. The sound was crisp, clear. I took another step, and from behind me, I heard the echo. It was perfect this time. It was the sound of my own step, following me, keeping pace, ensuring I never left the trail. I walked into the gray light. I walked toward the shadow of myself. I closed my eyes, but I could still see the trail stretching out forever in the dark behind my eyelids. The forest was quiet. The forest was waiting.